As it turns out, the most common search result that leads to my channel is the Pale Moon browser, if YouTube analytics are to be believed anyway, and so I thought it's probably about time to actually dedicate a video to this wretched browser. Pale Moon began as a Firefox fork which preaches about the ability for its users to be able to customize as much of the web browser as possible, whilst also ensuring no telemetry or baked-in advertising is shipped with the vanilla browser install. Though Pale Moon began its life as a fork of Firefox, as I've said, in the later half of 2009, it has since discontinued its support for modern additions and features that Firefox has, meaning that it isn't considered a fork of Firefox in the modern day, but rather taking on the description of being originally based upon Firefox source code, and since diverting so much in scope that the two are no longer compatible. In order to properly appreciate the cesspool that exists around Pale Moon, you need to know a little about the surrounding context first. So, if you don't know, and by God you're lucky if you don't, Pale Moon has quite the reputation for itself, being given the title of the dedicated web browser for furries by some users online. This is definitely just a little bit of memeing, but not without a little bit of merit, as you will soon see. Turns out, some of the more dedicated devs that work on Pale Moon are apparently quite toxic. Who would have thought, doing things like e-begging and the like? Now, for experienced internet users like you and me, of course, this is a story all too common and isn't really anything we would think twice about. Toxic dev developing open source projects doesn't really ring as breaking news. There's plenty of information around all of the little bits of trash talk and controversy on Reddit and the Pale Moon forum, so I'll put some links in the description in case you're so inclined to learn more. But TLDR, it's a bunch of degenerate losers who have nothing better to do with themselves complaining about people on the internet. Nothing more to it, if I am being honest. The issue with the modern version of Pale Moon, that is, the versions of the web browser that are no longer tethered to the Firefox codebase, is that they are relatively insecure and vulnerable to exploits and bugs. Now, this isn't so much uniquely related to Pale Moon as it is to every other browser that has been forked and then separated from the codebase of hugely popular web browsers like Chromium or Firefox, because web browsers inherently possess one of the most vulnerable vectors to be attacked by malicious code or adversaries on your computer. Web browsers often have hugely complicated code bases, requiring round-the-clock bug hunting, maintenance and security checks to ensure it is as secure as possible. After all, web browsers run on so many different and distinct machines that run all kinds of different architecture and components, not to mention other pieces of software that may try to interfere with the web browser and how it functions. It becomes necessary for the developers of web browsers to develop a sort of sandboxed container for the web browser and its various components to run in. This is an attempt to make the web browser as safe as possible and protect the host machine. Now, this is where the problems arise for Pale Moon, because it has divulged so far from the codebase of Firefox, it can no longer, and hasn't been able to for a while, rely on security and software patches for base Firefox made by Mozilla, meaning the devs that maintain Pale Moon have to do it themselves in a lot of cases. This isn't such a bash at those who enjoy Pale Moon or the ones maintaining it, just an observation of the facts that Pale Moon cannot be as secure as Firefox or even Chrome, purely because of how big they are and how many devs are required to maintain such a large code base that Pale Moon simply doesn't have. And that doesn't even include the voluntary support that the Pale Moon devs have in place for legacy software and support for older machines. It's using code that is old and outdated, and has to because of its aforementioned support for older software like legacy Firefox add-ons. Old code is vulnerable code. One genuine use case for Pale Moon that I can think of is if you really like customizing your browsers with scripts, or you're using an older OS like Windows 7 or some older version of OS X. The browser also maintains support for some old software like Adobe Flash Player, Silverlight and Java applets. Of course, maintaining support for something like Adobe Flash Player is quite the double-edged sword. I mean, the whole point modern browsers discontinued their support for it was because of the various security vulnerabilities it introduced, and with the advent of HTML5, it wasn't really needed anymore because of HTML5's ability to perform most of what Flash Player was used for, being able to natively complete actions in the web browser as opposed to relying on Flash Player, meant the browser was much more secure. Still, credit where credit is due for something like this, there's something interesting about the fact Pale Moon as an open source project in 2025 exists at all. The fact that it is capable of allowing you to load up Adobe Flash Player and use long abandoned Firefox extensions is kind of funky if you ask me, but don't get me wrong, there are, in my opinion, much better retro-styled alternative web browsers if that's what you're looking for, like SeaMonkey, which arguably does a better job at acting like a web browser, with the added benefit of actually supporting older style systems and 32-bit systems, which, even though it may seem like it, Pale Moon does not. It's also worth noting that the devs behind Pale Moon also worked on a broader, quote, ecosystem, if you could call it that ultimately died anyway. The Basilisk browser, which is another fork of Firefox / the Gecko engine, was originally developed by the same devs that work on Pale Moon, however, has recently shifted management and is now its own independent project, with a focus on a, quote, you get what you see kind of deal, with an extra emphasis on stability. It doesn't look like that bad of a browser. The Pale Moon browser requires a very specific user in order to properly enjoy its features. That specific user may have a little too much free time and a little too many images of anime girls on their hard drive, which may scare off some of the more level-headed and, well, normal people. And from the looks of things, this is where the aforementioned Basilisk browser comes in. It is different from Pale Moon, enough to warrant its original creation, but if you're really considering using either of these two browsers, I'd be pretty scared to ask why. You don't just stumble into using one of these browsers, you decide to use them, especially when it comes to something wretched like Pale Moon. It's a deliberate choice, one that comes with a certain level of risk. And if you ask me, keep it simple. Use hardened Firefox or the Mullvad browser. Stay away from the Furry browser, but in the same vein, it might be worth checking out the Basilisk browser if you're wanting a change of scenery. But then again, there are a plethora of Firefox forks to choose from, and in reality, how different are they from each other really? One of the main points of the Pale Moon browser existing, as said by the Moonchild developers themselves, the group who developed Pale Moon, is its ability to be changed with scripts and have the visuals edited by the user. But you can do all of that in Firefox, and you'd be saving yourself a lot of future headaches in terms of security if you just use a edited version of the Firefox browser, as opposed to using something like Pale Moon, which, as I've said, has discontinued its support for the incoming Firefox updates and security patches and features, etc. But there you have it, the Pale Moon browser, outdated, relatively unsecure, and full of furries. Comment down below your thoughts on Pale Moon. Are the furry associations outdated? Like the video if you did enjoy it, and subscribe to the channel. We are nearing the big 1000. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you in my next video.